There are moments in history where a single misunderstanding exposes the deepest fractures within a system, and today's story is one of those moments. Imagine a black woman walking up to a police station, calm, confident, and with every right to be there, only to be confronted, assaulted, and humiliated by the very officers sworn to protect the public. Now imagine the unbelievable twist that comes next. The officers only realized what they had done when she spoke 4 words that instantly froze the entire room. "I'm your chief." Welcome back to Swift Tale, the channel where real stories meet powerful lessons. And if this is your first time here, make sure to like, share, and subscribe. Because have you ever heard a story this shocking, this outrageous, and this revealing about the truth behind the badge? In today's episode, we break down one of the most stunning incidents of police misconduct in recent memory. A simple encounter outside a police station spiraled into aggression, disrespect, and force, until the officers discovered the woman they were roughing up wasn't a civilian at all, but their newly appointed chief of police. The moment her identity came out, careers collapsed instantly, protocols shattered, and the entire department was thrown into chaos. But this story is bigger than embarrassment, bigger than a personnel scandal, and bigger than one police department falling apart under the weight of its own behavior. This story is about assumptions, about how power, bias, and appearance shape the way officers choose to treat someone. It's about how quickly authority can crumble when truth steps into the light. And most importantly, it's about the difference between what some officers say they stand for and how they actually behave when they think no one important is watching. As we dive into this story, we will uncover the details leading up to the confrontation, the officers' split-second decisions that exposed the department's internal culture, and the jaw-dropping fallout that followed. You'll learn what really happened outside that police station, why the tension escalated, and how the chief's revelation not only ended multiple careers, but also sparked a larger conversation about race, respect, and accountability. Whether you're here for the drama, the justice, or the message behind it all, this story has something to say, and it demands to be heard. So sit back, stay with me until the very end, and let's explore how a routine moment turned into a career-ending disaster that the department never saw coming. And once again, if you're new to Swift Tale, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, because the truth deserves a platform, and your support helps us bring stories like this to light. To truly understand how this incident unfolded, we have to step back and look closely at the environment where it all took place. A community shaped by its history, a police department struggling with its identity, and simmering tensions that had been building long before the moment of confrontation. The city itself was a place of contrast, a mix of vibrant neighborhoods, long-standing traditions, and a population that wanted to believe in progress. Yet beneath the surface, there was a persistent strain of distrust between residents and law enforcement. Years of unresolved complaints, uneven policing practices, and a noticeable divide between officers and the people they served had created an atmosphere of unease. Even small interactions carried a weight of suspicion. For many in the community, a police uniform didn't always signal safety. It sometimes signaled fear, caution, or frustration. Inside the police department, things weren't much different. Morale had been shaky for months, especially as new leadership was being brought in to address ongoing issues. Officers were aware that reform was coming, but not everyone welcomed it. Some felt threatened by the changes, others were resistant to new expectations, and a few carried old habits that no amount of training seemed able to break. The department was operating on outdated assumptions and internal hierarchies, where respect was often tied to familiarity rather than professionalism. Officers who had been around for years felt ownership of the department's culture, while newer faces, especially those advocating for accountability, met silent pushback. Behind closed doors, the environment was tense, filled with quiet conversations and subtle power struggles, all of which would play a role in the events that followed. Even the area around the police station, where the incident occurred, reflected this tension. Residents walked by with caution, some avoiding eye contact with officers altogether. Reports of confrontations in that specific location weren't new. It was a place where misunderstandings often escalated quickly, especially when the officers on duty felt emboldened or unchecked. On the day of the incident, those very patterns were at play. The officers outside the station brought their assumptions, their biases, and their unresolved frustrations with them, creating a dangerous mix that was ready to spark the moment the chief arrived. In this environment, any encounter could go wrong, but this particular one was destined to explode. The officers didn't just see a person approaching the station, they saw a stranger, someone who didn't fit their expectations, someone whose presence they interpreted as a threat or a challenge. And because the culture inside the department had long allowed certain behaviors to go unchecked, the officers acted on impulse rather than professionalism. They treated her not based on who she was, but based on who they assumed she was. The irony is that the department had just appointed new leadership specifically to address these ingrained issues, yet the very flaws they were meant to fix would be exposed before the new chief even stepped through the station doors. This is the atmosphere in which everything happened, a city holding its breath, a community demanding better, and a department on the edge of reform. And it was within this fragile balance that a single, ordinary moment escalated into an extraordinary scandal that would reverberate far beyond the walls of the police station. Before the confrontation outside the station ever began, the woman at the center of this story was already a figure of influence, professionalism, and deep community respect. She wasn't just another face passing through the city, she was a dedicated law enforcement leader with a long track record of integrity, discipline, and service. Her career had been built step by step, rising through departments that challenged her, communities that believed in her, and positions that required not only strength, but fairness. She had worked in units ranging from community outreach to internal investigations, and every time she took on a new role, she carried with her a reputation for being firm but fair. Compassionate but unshakably principled, colleagues described her as someone who didn't wear her authority like armor, she carried it with humility and purpose. Her appointment as the new chief wasn't a product of chance or politics, but the result of years of service, leadership, and a proven ability to rebuild trust where it had been broken. She had been chosen specifically because the department needed a new direction, one based on accountability, transparency, and renewed relationships with the community. She was seen as the kind of leader who could walk into a troubled department and begin to mend it from the inside out. Yet ironically, many of the officers who would soon work under her had never seen her in person. Her arrival came without the typical fanfare, partly because she insisted on focusing on the work rather than appearances, and partly because her leadership transition was still in its early stages. Despite her high rank, she was someone who believed in staying connected to everyday experiences within the department. She wasn't the type to hide behind closed doors or separate herself from the officers on the ground. In every role she'd held before becoming chief, she made it a point to walk the same spaces, talk with the same people, and understand the same realities that her team faced. She believed that leadership without presence was leadership without purpose. This habit, this dedication to showing up wherever she was needed, was exactly what brought her to the station that day. She wasn't arriving with a full entourage or wearing anything that instantly announced her authority. She was simply doing what she had always done, being on the ground, in the field, observing firsthand how her department operated. However, her humility and grounded attitude also meant that people who didn't know her background might mistake her for an ordinary civilian. To some officers, especially those who had grown comfortable with a rigid hierarchy and preconceived notions, she didn't fit the image they had in mind for someone in power. She was a black woman, confident, composed, and unbothered by the lack of recognition. But in a department where respect was often given based on familiarity rather than merit, her presence that day was misread long before she said a single word. Officers who didn't recognize her didn't pause to think they might be interacting with someone above them. Instead, they responded based on assumptions shaped by years of unchecked biases and an internal culture that rewarded quick judgments. Her reputation outside the department made what happened next even more tragic and shocking. Community leaders saw her as a symbol of hope for real change. Residents who had long felt unheard believed she would bring a new level of fairness and professionalism to the role. For many, she represented the promise of a department that could finally rebuild its relationship with the people it served. But inside the station, where resistance to change had hardened over time, she was a threat to the status quo, even though most officers didn't yet know her face or understand the leadership she represented. And so, when she walked toward the police station that day, she carried with her decades of experience, the weight of a community's expectations, and the authority of the highest-ranking position in the department. Yet none of that mattered in the moments before the confrontation. To the officers who would soon approach her with aggression rather than respect, she was invisible, not because of who she was, but because of who they assumed she was. This fatal miscalculation would not only cost them their careers, but reveal exactly why she had been chosen to lead in the first place. On the day of the incident, nothing suggested that chaos was about to unfold. It was a routine afternoon, the kind of day where officers lingered outside the station, chatting casually between calls, unaware that every choice they were about to make would change not only their lives, but the entire department's future. The chief, meanwhile, had planned a series of unannounced drop-ins across precincts to observe the culture firsthand. She believed real understanding came from seeing a department in its natural state, not polished, not rehearsed, not performing for leadership. This station was one of her final stops, a location she had already heard rumors about: lax professionalism, inconsistent behavior, and a tendency for certain officers to treat the station entrance as their personal territory rather than a public space. As she approached, she wasn't dressed in formal uniform. She had purposely chosen attire that would make her look like any ordinary resident walking by. She wanted to see how officers interacted with the public when they didn't feel watched or evaluated. Her intent wasn't to trap anyone, but to understand what everyday people might face when seeking help or just passing through. She moved with quiet confidence, not rushing, not hesitating, just observing. But from a distance, one of the officers lounging near the entrance saw her as something entirely different. To him and his partners, she didn't look like someone with business there. She looked like someone to question, someone who didn't belong in their space, someone who must be approached with authority rather than respect. Moments before she arrived, the officers had been discussing a recent complaint filed against one of their colleagues. Their mood had been tense, laced with frustration and annoyance at what they felt was increasing scrutiny of their behavior. They blamed outsiders for interfering, resented administrative oversight, and were growing impatient with the new wave of reforms being pushed into the department. That frustration simmered beneath the surface. It made them quicker to judge, quicker to assume the worst, and quicker to treat civilians with an edge that violated the very code they had sworn to uphold. When they noticed the chief walking toward them, they didn't see a superior, they saw a perceived challenge. As she got closer, one officer stepped forward, not with a greeting or an offer of help, but with a confrontational tone that carried an unmistakable message. "What are you doing here?" Instead of asking politely or assessing the situation calmly, he closed the distance in a way that signaled dominance rather than professionalism. The chief stayed poised. She didn't flinch, didn't react aggressively, and didn't reveal her identity immediately. She simply tried to continue walking toward the door. But her calm demeanor only triggered more suspicion. To the officers, her lack of deference meant defiance. They saw her confidence as attitude, her silence as disrespect, and her refusal to be intimidated as a sign that she needed to be handled. What the officers didn't know was that she had already sensed the tension long before they spoke. Her years of experience told her exactly what kind of officers she was dealing with, the ones who challenged civilians unnecessarily, who interpreted authority as something to be performed rather than upheld, and who saw every interaction as an opportunity to assert dominance. She had encountered them before in other departments, and every time she'd made it her mission to reform or remove them. But this time, she hadn't expected her attempt to quietly observe would escalate so quickly. The situation became more hostile when a second officer joined in. Instead of diffusing the tension, he amplified it, echoing the same aggressive questioning, stepping so close that the encounter shifted from unprofessional to threatening. The chief tried to explain that she had business at the station, but the officers weren't interested in listening. They cut her off, talking over her, demanding answers she had already tried to give. Their tone grew sharper, their posture tightened. And with each passing second, the chance for a peaceful interaction slipped further away. Finally, one officer reached out, making physical contact under the pretense of getting her away from the entrance. But his grip wasn't gentle, it was forceful, unnecessary, and unmistakably aggressive. The chief pulled back, startled not by fear, but by the clear violation of protocol. That's when the situation erupted. The officers escalated instead of stopping. They surrounded her, raising their voices, ordering her to comply, and grabbing her arms as though she were a threat instead of the highest-ranking official in the department. In those critical moments before she revealed her identity, everything became clear. The officers weren't acting out of safety concerns, they were acting out of assumption, bias, and unchecked authority. They weren't protecting the station, they were guarding their ego. And as the confrontation reached a boiling point, they crossed a line that could never be undone. The incident that would end their careers had already begun, and they didn't even know it. The moment the officers laid hands on her, the atmosphere shifted from tense to explosive. What had begun as a verbal confrontation spiraled into physical aggression faster than anyone could process. The chief, still anonymous to them, felt one officer grip her arm with enough force to jolt her backward. She steadied herself, trying to maintain composure, but the suddenness of the grab made it clear that these officers weren't interested in de-escalation. Their approach wasn't about ensuring safety, it was about asserting dominance. The first officer tightened his hold, while the second moved in closer, blocking her path to the door as if he were detaining a suspect rather than questioning a civilian. The shift in their body language was stark. Crossed arms, squared shoulders, raised voices, everything about them screamed control, not communication. As she attempted to regain footing, the officers talking over each other only intensified the chaos. Each demand they threw at her contradicted the last. Step back. Show your ID. Stay where you are. A barrage of orders designed less for clarity and more to overwhelm. She tried to speak, tried to explain, but every word she attempted to get out was drowned by their escalating tone. Instead of listening, the officers interpreted her composure as defiance. One officer reached behind her shoulders and pushed her forward, attempting to force her against the wall of the station entrance. The push wasn't accidental, it was intentional, forceful, and fueled by the belief that she needed to be put in her place. The chief stumbled, but caught herself before falling completely. The moment her body hit the wall, onlookers nearby gasped, bystanders who happened to be walking by or waiting near the station froze, stunned by the sheer intensity unfolding in such a public setting. A few reached for their phones, unsure whether to record or intervene. The officers, noticing the growing attention, didn't back off. Instead, they doubled down. One officer barked for her to stop resisting, even though the only resistance came from her instinctive reaction to being shoved. She wasn't fighting back. She was simply trying to stay upright, her hands raised not in defiance, but to shield herself from further harm. What made the situation even more alarming was the speed with which the officers lost control of their professionalism. Their faces flushed, their voices rose to a near-shouting level, and their gestures became increasingly aggressive. The training they claimed to follow was nowhere to be seen. To them, she wasn't a leader or a citizen, she was a threat by virtue of standing her ground. One officer reached for his handcuffs, convinced in his own mind that she needed to be restrained. The chief's heart pounded, not from fear for her safety. She had faced far more dangerous situations in her line of work, but from disbelief at how recklessly these officers were acting in public, with witnesses, with no concern for the consequences. As the cuffs came out, the chief finally had to raise her voice, not to reveal her identity, but simply to stop the situation from becoming even worse. She demanded they keep their hands off her, her tone authoritative and sharp. But the officers weren't listening. Instead, the officer closest to her grabbed her wrist and twisted it in an attempt to force her arm behind her back. She winced as pain shot through her shoulder, yet even then she maintained her composure, refusing to lash out or escalate the situation further. And still, the officers interpreted her steady posture as a challenge. A third officer, who had been inside the station but came out after hearing the commotion, joined the group. Instead of assessing the situation objectively, he fell into step with his colleagues, adding to the chaos. Now surrounded by 3 armed men, the chief found herself pinned between them and the station wall. She could feel their breath, hear the adrenaline in their voices, sensed the sharp tension radiating from their hardened stances. It wasn't fear driving them, it was ego, combined ego. Collective ego, the kind that festers inside departments where authority is rarely questioned and mistakes are often dismissed. At this point, a small crowd had gathered, watching with disbelief. Some whispered anxiously, recognizing the excessive force. Others seemed frozen, unsure whether stepping in might worsen the situation. Through it all, the chief remained composed, steady, calculating. She had been trained to handle conflict, but not conflict like this. Conflict where the people causing harm were supposed to be the very ones protecting the public. She realized, in real time, that every fear the community had voiced about these officers was materializing right in front of her. And as the officers continued to restrain her, unaware of who they were manhandling, she knew that the moment she spoke her truth, the entire narrative and their careers would shatter instantly. But she didn't say it yet. She waited, watching how far they were willing to go, and they went farther. One officer pressed her shoulder harder, pinning her against the wall, while another shouted for her to stop resisting, even though she was barely moving. Their misconduct was unfolding in broad daylight, and still they acted with impunity. They never questioned themselves, never paused to evaluate the situation, never asked for identity before escalating to force. And that was their fatal mistake. Every shove, every grab, every shouted command was being witnessed by bystanders, by a camera across the parking lot, and worst of all for them, by the very woman they were supposed to report to. In those moments, the officers weren't just violating protocol, they were writing the end of their careers. As the officers tightened their grip, the chief realized the moment had come. She had given them every opportunity, every single second, to correct themselves, to reassess, to stop and think before acting. But they didn't. They continued treating her like a threat, a nuisance, a problem they needed to control. The officer, still gripping her wrist, twisted harder, his frustration growing with every second she didn't comply with the narrative he had already built in his head. And that was the turning point. Not because she was at risk of injury, she was seasoned enough to stay composed under pressure, but because their actions were becoming more reckless, more aggressive, and increasingly visible to the crowd forming around them. A hush fell over the bystanders as one officer lifted the handcuffs higher, preparing to lock them around her wrists. That was when she lifted her chin, looked directly at the officer in front of her, the one who had been barking orders the loudest, and spoke with a steady, resonant calm that cut through the chaos like a blade slicing through silence. "I'm your chief." The words hung in the air, heavy and unmistakable. For a split second, everything stopped. The officer holding her froze mid-motion, his hand trembling as the cuffs hovered just inches from her skin. The others exchanged looks of confusion, disbelief washing over their faces as if they'd misheard her. But they hadn't. The authority in her tone, the controlled certainty in her expression, and the sudden intensity of the bystanders' murmurs confirmed everything. The realization hit them like a shockwave. The first officer's face drained of color as his grip loosened instantly. His eyes widened, darting back and forth between the chief's face and the hands that had been restraining her just moments earlier. His voice cracked when he finally whispered, "Chief," as if hoping she'd deny it, hoping she'd tell him this was a misunderstanding, hoping she'd give him a lifeline out of the disaster he'd created. But she didn't. She simply stepped forward, adjusting her posture, letting her silence speak louder than any reprimand ever could. A ripple of panic spread among the officers. The second one stumbled backward, nearly tripping over the edge of the sidewalk as he tried to distance himself from what he had just done. The third officer removed his hands so quickly that he almost flung them away from her, his breathing heavy and erratic. They couldn't hide their fear, not of physical consequences, but of career-ending ones. They knew in an instant that everything they had just done was not only unprofessional, but indefensible. Their badges, their reputations, their futures, all of it had just collapsed at their feet. The chief didn't need to raise her voice. She didn't need to yell or curse or threaten. She simply stood tall, reclaiming her space, her dignity, and her authority with a level of control the officers had completely failed to show. The crowd around them erupted in reactions, gasps, whispers, murmurs of shock that rippled through the onlookers as they processed what they had just witnessed. Some people recorded the moment, cameras shaking slightly as they captured the officers' stunned expressions. Others stared with wide eyes, almost unable to believe the reversal of power unfolding in front of them. The officer closest to her attempted to stammer out an apology, but the chief cut him off with a raised hand, not out of anger, but out of sheer disappointment. She looked at all three of them, her expression calm but firm, the kind of look that spoke volumes. She didn't need to list their mistakes. The silence between them carried every necessary truth. They knew exactly what they had done, and they knew exactly what it meant. Instead of arguing, instead of justifying themselves, the officers stood there frozen, suddenly aware of how fragile their authority truly was when stripped of respect and professionalism. The chief's identity had rewritten the moment, but it hadn't erased their actions. They had revealed who they were before they ever discovered who she was. The power dynamic flipped instantly. Moments earlier, the officers believed they held control. Now they stood before the highest-ranking official in their department, exposed, frightened, and fully aware that their careers might never recover. And as the chief walked past them and into the station, unrestrained, unbothered, and unmistakably in command, one thing was certain. The truth had caught up with them, and the consequences were only just beginning. What followed in the hours and days after the incident was an explosion of emotion, outrage, disbelief, fear, and for many, a renewed sense of exhaustion. As the bodycam footage and witness videos circulated across social media, the public response grew louder by the minute. People weren't just upset because an assault had taken place. They were furious because it happened right outside a police station, a place expected to uphold justice, accountability, and discipline. The idea that officers felt comfortable enough to attack a woman in such a location shook the confidence of many community members. And once the truth came out, that the woman they assaulted was their own police chief, the outrage intensified and spread far beyond the city limits. Community leaders hosted emergency town hall meetings that quickly filled with angry residents demanding transparency and swift consequences. Social media campaigns were launched overnight, turning the incident into a national conversation about misconduct, racial bias, and the internal culture of police departments. For many, the event symbolized a much deeper problem, one that had been felt for years but rarely exposed this clearly. Voices that had previously been ignored suddenly gained strength as activists, pastors, local politicians, and ordinary citizens united to demand reform, accountability, and justice, not just for the chief, but for every person who had ever experienced mistreatment at the hands of those sworn to protect them. In the aftermath of the public uproar, the police department initiated a full-scale internal investigation, one that quickly became just as controversial as the incident itself. Typically, internal reviews of officer misconduct are slow, procedural, and often criticized for lacking transparency. But this time, the stakes were far higher. Not only did the department have to investigate the assault of a civilian, but that civilian turned out to be the very person responsible for leading and reforming the force. From the beginning, investigators faced a complicated landscape. Officers involved were scrambling to protect themselves, unions were stepping in with statements about protocol misinterpretations, and the department's leadership was under intense scrutiny from the community and the media. The officers' defense began forming almost immediately. Their initial statements claimed they did not know who the woman was and that her actions, whatever those may have been, made them perceive her as a threat. They pointed to non-compliance, failure to identify, and aggressive behavior, phrases commonly used in reports of force justification. But those explanations quickly fell apart as video evidence surfaced showing that she repeatedly attempted to speak, attempted to identify herself, and never displayed any threatening behavior. Bodycam footage contradicted nearly every part of the officers' written statements, creating an additional layer of concern. Not only had they used unnecessary force, but they appeared to have knowingly falsified the details afterward. As the investigation progressed, outside agencies were called in to ensure fairness, and this only heightened tensions. Officers were suspended, placed on administrative leave, or isolated from public duties, while union representatives continued defending their actions on technical grounds. Meanwhile, investigators conducted interviews, reviewed hours of footage, examined communication logs, and looked into whether the officers had a history of misconduct complaints. For many observers, this investigation became a critical test, not just of the department's integrity, but of policing structures in general. Could a system police itself effectively, especially when the victim was the very leader responsible for shaping that system? And more importantly, would the investigation reveal a deeper culture problem that went far beyond a single incident? The turning point in this entire ordeal came when the assaulted woman, still bruised, shaken, and recovering from the physical and emotional impact, stood before the cameras and revealed her true identity to the world. Until this moment, most people only knew her as the unnamed black woman who had been aggressively mishandled by her own officers outside their precinct. Rumors swirled, speculations spread, and assumptions filled the gaps. But when she stepped forward at the official press conference, wearing her uniform and introducing herself as the newly appointed chief of police, the room fell into a stunned silence. Her calm yet firm presence contrasted sharply with the brutality shown in the video, and that contrast only amplified the significance of what had been done to her. In her address, she spoke not with anger, but with clarity about accountability, systemic bias, abuse of power, and the urgent need for reform. She described the fear she felt in that moment, not just as a citizen, but as a leader who had expected more from the officers under her command. She explained that she had intentionally approached the precinct unannounced, wanting to observe how officers treated community members when leadership wasn't watching. What she experienced proved more revealing than she ever anticipated. Her message resonated deeply, especially with those who had long felt unseen or unheard when reporting complaints of mistreatment. The public response to her revelation was immediate and powerful. Community members flooded social media with support, admiration, and outrage. National news outlets picked up her story, bringing even more attention to the systemic issues highlighted by the incident. Many people expressed disbelief that officers could fail to recognize their own chief, but others pointed out that this only reinforced the broader problem. She wasn't seen as a leader, she wasn't even seen as a person worthy of basic respect, because of her race and gender. Her bravery in publicly confronting the issue created a ripple effect that inspired protests, petitions, and renewed calls for nationwide police reform. For many, she became a symbol of resilience, someone who refused to stay silent even when the injustice was directed at her personally. Her revelation did more than change the narrative. It forced the world to confront the uncomfortable truth about who is granted authority, who is denied it, and why. This story is a stark reminder that authority and respect are not automatically granted. They are earned, recognized, and upheld by both actions and awareness. The events outside the police station, the unnecessary assault, and the shocking reveal of the chief's identity are more than a viral headline. They are a case study in accountability, bias, and the consequences of unchecked power. What makes this incident so extraordinary is not just the aggression of the officers, but the culture that allowed it to happen in the first place. A culture where assumptions can override protocol, where ego can outweigh training, and where leadership can be ignored until the consequences become unavoidable. For those of us watching from the outside, it's a moment that challenges how we think about authority, race, gender, and the systems designed to protect the public. As the dust settles, there are lessons to take away for everyone, not just law enforcement. We learn the importance of respecting all individuals, regardless of how they appear or whether they immediately fit into our assumptions about power. We see the critical role of transparency and accountability in preventing abuses, and we are reminded that courage and professionalism matter at every level of leadership. The chief's composure, restraint, and decisive action in revealing her identity turned what could have been a simple harassment case into a powerful statement about justice and integrity. It also serves as a warning to anyone who underestimates the consequences of their actions, whether in a department, workplace, or community. To the audience of Swift Tale, stories like these aren't just entertainment. They are opportunities to think critically, reflect on the world around us, and consider how each of us can contribute to accountability and fairness in our own spheres. If you've been following this story, you know that change doesn't happen by accident. It happens when people speak up, when injustices are exposed, and when those in power are held responsible. And now, we want to hear from you. What do you think this incident teaches us about leadership, respect, and systemic reform? How would you respond if you were in the chief's position or even in the officer's? Share your thoughts in the comments below, because your perspective is part of this conversation. Finally, if this story has made an impact on you, consider supporting Swiftail by liking, sharing, and subscribing. By doing so, you help ensure that stories of courage, accountability, and truth continue to reach a wider audience. Don't just watch, engage, discuss, and bring these conversations into your own communities. Every view, every comment, and every share amplifies the message that actions have consequences, leadership matters, and standing up for what is right is never optional. Thank you for joining us, and remember, the world changes when truth meets courage, and this story proves that in ways we will never forget. Beyond the immediate drama of the assault and the career-ending consequences for the officers involved, this story offers profound lessons about leadership and identity that resonate far beyond one police department. Leadership is often misunderstood as a position or a title, but this incident underscores that true authority comes from recognition, presence, and the ability to inspire respect through action. The chief's approach, walking into her precinct without fanfare, observing the department as it operated naturally, and maintaining composure under threat, demonstrates the qualities of a leader who commands attention not through intimidation, but through integrity and calm authority. She didn't need to raise her voice or resort to aggression. Her identity and the clarity with which she asserted it were enough to expose the flaws around her. Equally important is the lesson about identity and perception. The officers failed to see her for who she was, instead allowing assumptions and implicit biases to dictate their behavior. Their inability to recognize her authority until she spoke illustrates a broader societal challenge. People in leadership, particularly women and individuals from marginalized groups, often have to work harder to have their positions acknowledged and respected. Identity isn't just a personal matter. It interacts with culture, expectations, and power dynamics in ways that can either uplift or undermine a leader. In this case, the chief's presence alone was enough to disrupt entrenched patterns, highlighting how authority is not just about rank, but about recognition, credibility, and the courage to assert oneself when challenged. The story also reminds us that leadership carries responsibilities that extend beyond the individual. A leader must anticipate challenges, protect integrity, and serve as a model for others. By choosing to remain composed, to de-escalate while still asserting her position, and to confront the misconduct transparently, the chief demonstrated that leadership is both a shield and a lens. It protects those under your guidance while simultaneously exposing systemic weaknesses that need attention. Her actions offer a template for anyone in a position of authority, whether in law enforcement, business, or public service, showing that true leadership balances accountability, fairness, and presence. Finally, this incident provides a cautionary tale for those who underestimate the consequences of ignoring hierarchy, respect, and professional responsibility. Authority isn't static. It is earned and must be recognized in both action and perception. When people fail to acknowledge leadership, act recklessly, or allow biases to guide behavior, they invite consequences that go beyond immediate reprimands. They threaten trust, morale, and organizational integrity. The broader lesson here is clear. Leadership is not defined by title alone, identity is not negotiable, and integrity is non-negotiable. For viewers of Swiftail, these lessons serve as both reflection and inspiration. To lead well, to act with awareness, and to always recognize the authority and humanity of those around you. While the immediate incident shocked the public, it also highlighted much deeper systemic issues that plague institutions of authority. The officer's behavior was not simply a result of individual error. It was the product of ingrained cultural assumptions, unchecked power dynamics, and bias that had long been allowed to persist within the department. Their failure to recognize the chief was not a one-off mistake. It reflected an organizational mindset where authority is interpreted through narrow lenses, where assumptions about race, gender, and appearance can override protocol, and where actions are too often guided by personal ego rather than professional responsibility. This pattern is not unique to this precinct. It echoes across departments, workplaces, and institutions where culture protects habitual behaviors and resists accountability. Bias, both implicit and explicit, was at the center of this confrontation. The officers had a preconceived image of what authority looks like, and because the chief did not match that image, their instincts bypassed reason and training. This incident illustrates a common problem. When identity does not conform to stereotypes, people in power can fail to recognize legitimate authority, and those who challenge the status quo may be marginalized or dismissed. The situation outside the station became a real-world example of how bias can escalate from thought to action, producing consequences that extend far beyond the individuals involved. What might have been a brief confrontation turned into a public scandal precisely because assumptions guided behavior at every step. Power dynamics within the department also played a critical role. The officers involved wielded the authority of their positions without the corresponding discipline or self-awareness, believing they could act without repercussion. They misused their positional power, thinking that physical force could replace respect and that intimidation could substitute for protocol. The incident exposed how institutional power, when unchecked, can become destructive. It allowed officers to treat someone as subordinate who was, in reality, their superior. This misalignment between perceived and actual authority created the perfect storm, underscoring how structural flaws in hierarchy and culture can amplify mistakes into crises. Finally, this incident underscores the urgent need for systemic reform. Training alone is insufficient if departments fail to address underlying cultural biases, if promotions are not accompanied by accountability measures, and if leadership does not actively model ethical behavior. The assault outside the station is both a cautionary tale and a call to action. It shows that when assumptions, bias, and misuse of power intersect, the results can be career-ending, organization-shattering, and community-alienating. For viewers of Swift Tale, the lesson is clear. Systemic problems cannot be ignored. Individual actions reflect broader cultural patterns, and meaningful change requires both awareness and action. The aftermath of the incident rippled far beyond the walls of the police station, profoundly affecting the local community and prompting discussions about long-term reforms. Residents who had long felt marginalized or unheard saw the assault on their chief as both a personal affront and a reflection of the broader challenges within the department. For many, the incident confirmed long-held suspicions about misconduct, bias, and the imbalance of power in policing, reigniting conversations about accountability, trust, and transparency. Town halls, community meetings, and social media discussions became platforms for citizens to voice frustration and demand immediate action, making it clear that the public would no longer tolerate behavior that undermined both the rule of law and the credibility of law enforcement. In response, the department initiated structural reforms designed to prevent similar incidents in the future. Policies around the use of force, officer interactions with civilians, and recognition of authority were re-evaluated and strengthened. Officers received additional training focused not only on procedural compliance, but also on cultural competency, implicit bias, and de-escalation techniques. Leadership emphasized accountability, making it clear that misconduct, even by the smallest infraction, would not be ignored. Beyond the department, city officials partnered with community organizations to establish oversight programs, citizen advisory boards, and open channels for feedback, aiming to bridge the gap between law enforcement and the people they serve. The public's response, both supportive of the chief and critical of the officer's behavior, reinforced the importance of transparency and the role of community oversight. Local activists highlighted the necessity of systemic changes that would outlast a single scandal, ensuring that future incidents could be prevented through proactive monitoring and education. The chief herself played a central role in these reforms, using the incident as a teachable moment to model leadership that emphasizes integrity, respect, and accountability. Her efforts helped restore some measure of trust, demonstrating that meaningful change requires courage, persistence, and visible leadership that listens to and acts on community concerns. Ultimately, the incident served as a turning point for the city and the department. While the assault was shocking and unacceptable, the response revealed the potential for reform and improvement. Citizens, officers, and leadership alike were reminded that accountability is not optional, that trust must be earned continuously, and that the consequences of ignoring systemic issues can reverberate far beyond a single incident. For viewers of Swift Tale, this chapter of the story underscores the importance of vigilance, engagement, and advocacy. Communities have the power to demand reform, and institutions have the responsibility to respond with transparency, fairness, and lasting change. As the story unfolded, interviews and public statements from key figures provided deeper insight into the incident and its lasting impact. The chief, speaking in multiple interviews, emphasized accountability, leadership, and the importance of confronting misconduct head-on. She highlighted that the confrontation outside the station was not just about her personally, but a reflection of systemic issues that could no longer be ignored. In her words, the incident offered an opportunity for the department to learn, grow, and implement meaningful reforms that prioritized both professionalism and the safety of the community. Her calm yet resolute approach set the tone for the public conversation, demonstrating that leadership is most effective when paired with transparency and integrity. Statements from the officers involved, meanwhile, were widely scrutinized. Some expressed regret, acknowledging that their assumptions and actions were misguided. Others leaned on procedural defenses, attempting to frame their behavior as following protocol, even as evidence contradicted their accounts. These conflicting narratives only highlighted the gap between perceived authority and actual responsibility. The contrast between the chief's measured perspective and the officer's defensive stance underscored the lesson that credibility is built not on rank or position alone, but on ethical, consistent behavior under scrutiny. The legacy of the incident extends beyond individual careers. Within the department, policies were revised, new training programs implemented, and a culture of accountability reinforced. Leadership changes prompted a broader re-evaluation of how officers interact with both the public and their superiors, emphasizing respect, communication, and recognition of authority. For the community, the story became a symbol of hope and a reminder that systemic change is possible when courage meets accountability. Outside the city, the incident sparked discussions nationwide about racial bias, gender, and the treatment of authority figures who challenge entrenched norms. For many, the incident also served as a powerful narrative about resilience and the impact of standing firm in the face of aggression. The chief's decision to address the incident publicly, rather than allowing it to be buried or misrepresented, reinforced the importance of leadership that confronts wrongdoing openly. Her actions left a lasting impression not only on the department and the city, but also on a broader audience, inspiring conversations about fairness, leadership, and the necessity of challenging assumptions wherever they appear. Ultimately, this story will be remembered not merely for the shocking confrontation, but for the lessons it imparted about integrity, accountability, and the enduring importance of ethical leadership. As we reflect on this extraordinary story, it becomes clear that justice and accountability are not abstract concepts. They are lived experiences that require vigilance, courage, and integrity. The incident outside the police station serves as a powerful reminder that the systems designed to protect the public and uphold the law can only function effectively when those entrusted with authority act responsibly. When assumptions, bias, and misuse of power go unchecked, consequences ripple outward, affecting careers, communities, and the very trust that sustains institutions. This story illustrates that even the smallest decisions, how an officer approaches someone, the assumptions they make, the tone they take, can escalate into moments that redefine lives and public perception. Justice, in this context, was not simply about holding the officers accountable. It was about restoring faith in leadership and demonstrating that wrongdoing, no matter how entrenched, will eventually be recognized and addressed. The chief's measured response, her ability to maintain composure while confronting aggression, and her transparency in communicating with the public all reinforced that true accountability requires courage and action. By confronting the incident openly, She not only rectified the immediate wrongs, but also created a blueprint for systemic improvement, showing that justice is most effective when paired with visibility, ethical leadership, and a commitment to reform. Equally important is the broader message for communities and organizations everywhere. Accountability is not optional, and silence or complicity can perpetuate harm. The officer's assumptions and actions were symptomatic of larger structural problems: bias, lack of oversight, and a culture that allowed misconduct to persist. The public reaction, combined with institutional reforms, demonstrates that accountability is multidimensional, involving individual responsibility, leadership oversight, and active community engagement. This story underscores the necessity of questioning authority, recognizing bias, and ensuring that systems are designed to protect integrity and fairness at every level. For viewers of Swift Tale, the takeaway is clear. Courage and ethical action have the power to expose systemic flaws, challenge assumptions, and inspire meaningful change. While the immediate consequences impacted the officers' careers, the lasting impact reaches far beyond the precinct. It resonates with anyone who has experienced injustice, who has struggled against bias, or who has sought to make systems more equitable. This story proves that truth, when combined with decisive leadership, can overcome entrenched power, correct wrongs, and transform institutions. Ultimately, the assault outside the station is more than a shocking event. It is a lesson in accountability, integrity, and the enduring importance of ethical leadership. It reminds us that authority must be recognized and respected, that biases must be confronted, and that justice requires both action and courage. The chief's composure, the public's engagement, and the institutional reforms that followed ensure that this moment will be remembered not just for the scandal, but for the transformative lessons it provides. As we close this chapter, let it serve as a call to reflect on how we, individually and collectively, uphold justice in our communities, workplaces, and institutions, and how vigilance, courage, and accountability are essential for creating a fairer, safer, and more ethical world.